I am Padre del Valle, and this is Realidad Mexico. There are places in our country that do not exist, not on tourist maps, not in campaign promises. They are blank spaces, stained by poverty and neglect, corners devoured by vegetation and silence, where time does not move forward. It rots, where the laws of men vanish like smoke from a fire. Today, we are not going to talk about the big headlines, not about drug trafficking, not about corruption in government palaces. Today, we are going to descend into a much more intimate hell. Quieter, older, a hell that hides in broad daylight, behind rotten wooden doors and eyes that know everything, but remain silent out of fear or out of habit. We are going to the mountains of Puebla, to a nameless village, to a house without windows, to a place where blood is thicker than the law, where tradition is twisted into a cage of flesh and bone, and love is perverted into the most heinous of sins. This is the story of a pact sealed not with ink nor with blood, but with the complicit silence of an entire community. The story of two children, Citlali and Santiago, brother and sister, forced to become a new Adam and a new Eve, forced to commit the unthinkable to save a family legacy tainted by madness. If you have the courage to listen to the end, stay. Subscribe. Not for me, not for the channel, but for them, because their whispers, drowned out for years by the wind in the mountains, deserve to become a cry for once, a cry that shakes the conscience of this sleeping country. This is Realidad Mexico, and reality sometimes is a wound that refuses to heal. The truth never comes as a divine revelation. It is not a bolt of lightning in a clear sky. It comes in fragments, in small details that don't fit together, like a piece of a puzzle that belongs in another box, like a discordant note in a sad song. For Elena Ramirez, the truth began with silence, an unnatural silence. Elena was a newly graduated social worker. She was 24 years old, and a heart full of that naive and dangerous faith that only young people have. Faith that the system, despite everything, works. Faith that the world can be fixed with willpower and the right forms. The system sent her to a small rural clinic deep in the mountains of Puebla, a job no one wanted. It's a great opportunity to start, to gain experience, her supervisor in the city told her, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. A white lie, a banishment disguised as an opportunity. The first few months were a baptism of harsh reality. Poverty here was not a statistic in a report. It was the constant smell of damp wood and wet earth. It was the cracked adobe walls through which a bone-chilling cold seeped in. It was the children with empty eyes, their skin covered in bites and their stomachs swollen from parasites. Elena worked tirelessly, from sunrise to sunset. She vaccinated. She gave talks on hygiene. She tried to teach mothers how to identify malnutrition in their children. She constantly came up against a wall, an invisible wall made of ancestral mistrust and closely guarded secrets. "That's how things are here, miss," the women would say, lowering their gaze. "Don't get involved in things that don't concern you. God squeezes, but he doesn't strangle." Clichés that were shields against her curiosity, against her help. It was in that environment that she saw them for the first time. Citlali and Santiago. They arrived at the clinic one foggy morning. The girl had a persistent fever that wouldn't break. She was about 13. He was perhaps 15. They weren't like the other children in the community. The others ran, shouted, fought. They were wild and full of life. Not them. They moved together, in a thick silence, as if tied by an invisible thread. He was always one step behind her, a guardian. Their eyes were not those of children. They were ancient, tired, infinitely sad, as if they had seen the end of time and returned without enthusiasm. Elena tried her usual routine, a friendly smile, a soft voice. "Hello, sweetheart. What's your name?" she asked the girl. Citlali didn't answer. She pressed her lips together and looked down at the hard-packed earth. It was her brother who answered for her, without looking at her. "Her name is Citlali." His voice was deep for his age, monotonous, without inflection. "And you?" "Santiago." When Elena took Citlali's arm to put the thermometer in her mouth, she noticed that the girl was shaking violently. But it wasn't from fever. It was a deep, internal tremor, a contained terror. Santiago, who was watching every move, took a step forward, his eyes fixed on Elena's hand, not with curiosity, with a cold, animal hostility, the look of a guard dog protecting its wounded young. Elena instinctively withdrew her hand. At that moment, she felt the first real pang of unease. Something here was fundamentally broken, terribly wrong. That day, the wrong piece of the puzzle had fallen onto her desk, and her conscience would no longer allow her to ignore it. The silence of the mountains was about to be broken. A social worker's curiosity is her best tool. But in the mountains, it is also a deadly danger. Elena began to ask questions, subtly, carefully, in the small village market, while buying vegetables, to the women who went to the communal well for water, with their buckets and hunched backs. "The De La Cruz family. Do you know them?" The reaction was always the same, immediate, a quick, nervous glance to the sides, a shrug of the shoulders, a change of subject. "They live up there," they would say, pointing vaguely toward the mountains. "They're isolated. They have their ways." No one would say more. The name De La Cruz was like a forbidden word, a taboo, a door that no one wanted to open. Frustrated, Elena searched through the dusty files at the clinic. They were sparse and disorganized, yellowed sheets filled with irregular handwriting. But she found something. The surnames in that region were repeated ad infinitum: Garcia, Hernandez, Perez, Martinez. But the surname De La Cruz was unique, and it appeared linked to a single family line, that of Citlali and Santiago. There were no cousins. There were no uncles with that surname in the records. Just a direct line, vertical, like a stake driven into the ground. Parents, grandparents, great-grandparents. An isolated dynasty in the middle of nowhere. A genetic island. One day, as she was closing the clinic, a shadow appeared at the door. It was Doña Elodia, the village healer. An old woman with weather-beaten skin and eyes like two dark, wise wells. She approached Elena without making a sound. "Leave that family alone, child," she whispered. Her breath smelled of bitter herbs and earth. Elena started. "What do you mean?" "You know what I mean," said the old woman, staring at her intently. "There are bloodlines that must not mix with others, and there are bloodlines that are forbidden to end. They are protecting theirs. It is their burden. Leave them to it." Instead of frightening her, the warning sparked something in Elena. Protect the bloodline? A burden? It wasn't an answer. It was a clue. She decided to do what the system explicitly forbade her to do. An unannounced visit. No protocol, no papers, no permission. She climbed the mountain one afternoon when the sun was beginning to paint the sky orange and purple. The path was a scar of dry mud and loose stones. As she climbed, the air became thinner. The silence grew deeper, heavier. It was an oppressive silence, broken only by the buzzing of insects and the beating of her own heart. The De La Cruz house was at the end of the road, isolated, menacing. It looked like a small fortress, an adobe bunker. It had no windows on the front, just a solid wooden door darkened by the weather. A column of pale, languid smoke rose from an adobe chimney. Elena stopped. She felt the first chill of real fear, a physical fear. Her hands were sweating. A knot formed in her stomach. She could turn around, go back to the clinic, write a vague report and forget everything, do her job and save herself. But the image of Citlali's eyes stopped her. Those eyes that begged for help without uttering a single sound. She took a deep breath, the cold air filling her lungs, and she knocked on the door. The sound echoed in the silence, dry, profane. For a long minute, there was no answer, only the wind. Elena was about to leave when the door opened with a sharp, painful squeak. An elderly woman appeared in the doorway. She was thin, bony like a bird, but with an upright, defiant posture. Her hair was a single braid, long and white as snow, falling down her back. Her eyes, black and piercing, were the same as Santiago's. But they were hardened by time. She was the matriarch, the guardian of the secret. She was the grandmother, Remedios de la Cruz. "What do you want?" she said. Her voice was not that of a frail old woman. It was like the edge of a knife. "I'm the social worker from the clinic," Elena stammered, suddenly feeling like an intruder, a child. "I just wanted to see how Citlali is doing." The old woman studied her from head to toe. Her gaze was like a scalpel. An almost imperceptible smile, cold as ice, appeared on her thin lips. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. Elena crossed the threshold, and she felt as if the door had closed behind her forever. She had entered the heart of darkness. The inside of the house smelled of confinement, of damp, of old dust. And something else, something sweet and rancid, like forgotten flowers in a vase rotting in stagnant water. The main room was almost empty, austerity taken to the extreme. A rough wooden table and 2 benches, nothing else. In one corner, a small altar with a faded Virgin Mary, her plaster face cracked. Candles burned down to the base. The adobe walls were bare, cold to the touch. Elena felt the cold seeping into her bones. It wasn't the cold of the mountains. It was the cold of absence, of the lack of life, of the lack of joy. "They're in their room," said Grandmother Remedios, her voice echoing in the silence. She pointed to a dirty cloth curtain hanging from a doorframe. The old woman's voice had absolute, unbreakable authority. Elena walked toward the curtain. Each step felt heavy, as if she were walking underwater. The musty smell grew stronger as she got closer. She took a deep breath and pulled the fabric aside. The room was a cell, small, oppressive, windowless. The only light came from a single low-voltage bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting a sickly yellow glow over the scene. In the center was a bed, a single wooden bed with a thin mattress sagging from use. And on that bed were Citlali and Santiago. They weren't playing. They weren't talking. They were lying next to each other in a deathly silence. Citlali's head rested on Santiago's chest. Her small hand held his. There was no innocence in that image. It was not the comfort between siblings. There was a heavy, adult intimacy, a terrible resignation that froze the blood. They were dressed, but the atmosphere in the room was thick, charged with something Elena didn't dare name. Chitlali looked up. When she saw Elena standing in the doorway, her eyes widened. For a second, just a second, Elena saw the girl she should have been. A terrified little girl. A little girl begging for help with her eyes. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the mask of emptiness fell back over her face. Santiago rose slowly, with an almost threatening fluidity. He sat down on the edge of the bed, placing his body between Elena and his sister. A human shield. His gaze was pure hatred, a calm, deep, unbroken hatred. "Go," he said in a low voice. It wasn't a request. It was an order. That's when the grandmother spoke from behind them. Elena jumped. Her voice was calm, patient, almost didactic, as if she were explaining an ancient recipe. "Blood calls to blood," she said. "It's the oldest law." Elena turned to look at her, her heart pounding against her ribs. Horror began to form in her mind, an idea so monstrous that her brain refused to accept it. What are you saying?" Remedios smiled again, that joyless smile. The parents of these children made a mistake, a sin. They left. They mixed with outsiders. They brought weakness and disease into this house. They died for it. It was God's punishment, just. She paused, savoring the weight of her words, watching the effect they had on Elena. But God is merciful, and He gives us a second chance. Through them. She pointed to the children with a movement of her chin. They will cleanse our bloodline. They will purge the mistake of their parents. They will create the new offspring. Strong, pure, as it should be, as it always was. Elena felt the ground opening beneath her feet. The air became thick, impossible to breathe. A metallic taste, the taste of pure fear, flooded her mouth. Incest. The word exploded in her mind with the force of a bomb. This was not an isolated act. It was a command. A mission cloaked in sacredness, driven and supervised by a delirious old woman. The children were not victims of something hidden, but pieces in a senseless agreement, props in a twisted doctrine. You're forcing them," Elena whispered, her voice breaking. The grandmother shrugged, a gesture of total indifference. "I'm just reminding them of their duty. It's the will of the blood. It's our destiny. They understand." Elena looked back at the children, at their tense bodies, at their dead eyes. And she understood the truth in all its monstrous and devastating dimension. It wasn't a house. It was a tomb, a laboratory. And they were the living sacrifices. She had to lean against the doorframe to keep from falling. The world had become blurry. All that remained was the smell of rotten flowers and the calm, serene voice of madness. Sound of wind, a long, tense silence. How is a monster like Remedios de la Cruz born? Monsters are not born. They are built, brick by brick, disappointment upon disappointment, humiliation upon humiliation. The story of the de la Cruz family, according to Remedios' personal gospel, was the story of a fall. A long, slow fall from imagined grace into nothingness. According to family legend, they were descendants of a Spanish lineage, almost noble. They arrived in Mexico centuries ago, with land, with a name. With blood they considered superior, untouchable. That was the first stone of delirium. Pride, the belief that they were different, better. For generations, they married among distant cousins, endogamy to preserve that supposed purity. They lived in their own bubble of arrogance, looking down on the rest of the world. While the world around them changed, then came the revolution, the agrarian reform, the New Mexico. They lost their land. Their names ceased to mean anything. The money ran out. They became what they despised most, poor peasants, just like everyone else. That was the second blow. The humiliation, the resentment that simmers for decades. Remedios was born in the midst of this decline. He grew up listening to stories of lost greatness. He saw his father die of alcohol and bitterness, cursing the government. She saw her mother sell the last of the family's jewelry for a sack of corn. The outside world became the enemy, the one who had stolen everything from them, the one who wanted to wipe them out. When her turn came, Remedios married a man from the village, a Hernandez. Her family disowned her, but she had no choice. Pure blood no longer filled their stomachs. She had 2 sons, Citlali and Santiago's father, and a daughter. And she silently swore that with her, the fall would stop, that she would somehow restore the lost honor. But her children betrayed her, just as the world had betrayed her. Her daughter fell in love with a mechanic from the city and ran away. She never heard from her again. She declared her dead. Her son, the father of the children, committed the worst of sins. He married an indigenous woman from a neighboring community. The final stain. Remedios tolerated them. They lived under her roof, but drowned in her silent contempt. She looked at her grandchildren, Citlali and Santiago, and in them she saw the mixed blood, the impurity, the defeat. Then, what she called the blessing happened. One stormy night, her parents took the old truck to go to the city to buy medicine. They never returned. The police said a landslide on the road had swallowed them up. An accident. Remedios said it was the hand of God, purging the stain, cleaning the canvas, leaving her with the raw material, the 2 children, her grandchildren. The last chance to right the wrong, to start over, to force the blood to cleanse itself through the fire of taboo. The pact was not imposed in a day. It was a slow, cruel, meticulous indoctrination. It began on the day of her parents' funeral. Santiago was 10 years old. Citlali was 8. Remedios isolated them completely. Out there is only sin, she told them. There are only people who hate us for who we are, for our blood. She told them the story of their lineage, not as a tale, as a prophecy. You are special. You carry the blood of the ancients. But it is contaminated. It is your duty to cleanse it. She forbade them to play with other children. School lasted only until they learned to read. To read the family Bible, the only book in the house. A Bible with Remedios' delirious notes in the margins. When Santiago entered puberty, the real horror began. The grandmother began to talk to them about their sacred duty, of the need to make a new beginning, together. The first time she forced them to sleep in the same bed, Citlali cried all night, silently, so as not to provoke her. Santiago lay still as a statue, paralyzed by fear and confusion. Their grandmother sat in a chair outside the room, the door ajar, praying aloud. "It is God's will," she repeated like a mantra. "It is for the good of the blood." Fear became routine. Routine became resignation. Horror became normal. It became their only reality. Santiago learned not to feel, to build a wall inside his mind. Citlali learned to disappear inside herself, to go to a place where no one could touch her. The house in the mountains became her world. and her grandmother's madness became her only terrible law. This was the hell Elena had discovered, a hell built with perverted love and rotten pride, a legacy of madness passed down as a sacred inheritance. Sound of an office door opening and closing, murmurs in the background, a phone ringing in the distance. Elena ran. She ran like she had never run before. She stumbled down the mountain, branches scratching her face, her heart in her throat, and Remedio's words echoing in her head. She didn't stop until she reached the town hall, a dusty village with a dilapidated town hall and a police station that smelled of cheap disinfectant and despair. She ran inside, out of breath. The commander in charge, a burly man with a thick mustache and a uniform shirt that was too tight, looked at her over his reading glasses. His name was Rojas. "What's going on, miss? Looks like a snake scared you," he said with a mocking smile. Elena, trying to catch her breath, tried to explain. The words came out in a jumble, incoherent with panic. The children, Grandma, Citlali, and Santiago. He forces them in the same bed. The blood. Commander Rojas listened without changing his expression. Without moving, he let her finish her feverish account. Then he leaned back in his chair, which creaked in protest under his weight. He let out a long, weary sigh. "Miss Ramirez," he said with condescending patience, as if speaking to a child. "You're new here. You don't understand how things are in the mountains." "How are things? What I saw is a crime. It's monstrous." Elena shouted, her voice trembling with rage and frustration. "It's a family matter." "Things of the mountains," he replied, lowering his voice, almost bored. "The De La Cruz family has always been special. They have their customs. They're strange people. It's best not to get involved. Take my advice. Stay out of it. They're children. They're in danger. It's your job to protect them." The commander shrugged, a gesture that said it all. He took a sip of coffee that seemed cold. "Look, in order for me to send a patrol up there, to a place that's difficult to access, I need a formal complaint, signed, and I need evidence, facts. Did you see anything? Did you see a sexual act? Or did you just sense an atmosphere? Because I can't fill a report with atmospheres." The question was a slap in the face. Humiliation. It reduced her to a hysterical, delusional woman. I know what I saw," Elena stammered. "Well, when you have it on paper with facts, not assumptions from a recent graduate, come back and we'll talk. In the meantime, I have real problems to deal with. There's a cattle rustling problem in the neighboring community, and that does affect the economy." He turned back to his papers. The conversation was over. Elena stood in the middle of the office. She felt a wave of coldness. It wasn't the cold of the mountains. It was the cold of indifference. The cold of cynicism, the first wall of the system, and she had just crashed into it. Pause. Sound of a computer keyboard, a rubber stamp repeatedly hitting paper. She didn't give up. If the local police wouldn't help her, she would go higher, to the state capitol. The next day, she took the first bus. It was a 4-hour trip that seemed like an eternity. She arrived at the offices of the DIF, the System for Integral Family Development. The building was modern, with air conditioning and shiny floors, a parallel universe to that of the mountains. It took her 3 hours of waiting and explaining her story to 3 different secretaries to get an appointment with a deputy director. A woman in her 50s, wearing an impeccable suit and looking chronically tired. Her name was Licenciada Figueroa. Elena told her story again, this time more calmly, with more details, with the precision of a witness. She spoke of the children's eyes, of the single bed, of the exact words of Grandmother Remedios. Licenciada Figueroa listened, nodding from time to time. She took notes on a notepad with an expensive pen. When Elena finished, the woman took off her glasses. She cleaned them meticulously with a silk handkerchief. "This is a very delicate situation, Miss Ramirez," she said in a soft, almost clinical voice. "I appreciate your concern. You are very passionate." The word passionate sounded like a diagnosis, as if it were a problem. What you are describing is a presumption of domestic violence and possible corruption of minors. It is very serious. Elena felt a spark of hope. Finally, someone understood. "So, are you going to do something? Are you going to get them out of there?" The lawyer sighed, a professional bureaucrat sigh. She opened a drawer and took out a stack of forms. "In order for us to intervene, we need to open a full case file. First, we need you to fill out the SV301 complaint form. You will need 2 copies with your signature and attach a copy of your official ID." She placed the form in front of Elena. It was a maze of boxes and legal jargon. "Then, one of our teams would have to make a field assessment visit. But we can't just go there. We need a court order or at least a police report justifying the urgency. Do you have the file number of your complaint with Commander Rojas?" He refused to file it, Elena said, her hope deflating. Ms. Figueroa frowned. "Well, that complicates things. Without a police report, my team would be going in cold. The family could deny them access, and legally, we couldn't do anything. It would be trespassing." She continued, her voice a monotonous, bureaucratic drone. "What I suggest is this. Go back to your community. Try to gain the children's trust. Get a direct testimony. If the girl, Citlali, confesses the abuse to you directly, and you can record it on your cell phone, then we would have a solid case to present to the judge." Elena looked at her, incredulous. Horror churned in her stomach. "Are you asking me to put a traumatized child in an even more vulnerable position? To make her the main witness against her own family in a community where no one will protect her? That I commit a crime to prove another one?" Ms. Figueroa stood up, a polite signal that the meeting was over. "Miss Ramirez, I understand your frustration, but we have protocols. We can't act on intuition or vibes. The system is designed to protect everyone's rights, including Mrs. de la Cruz's rights." She looked at her with a hint of professional pity, distant. "Fill out the form. That's the first step. Once we receive it, we'll forward it to the appropriate department. The process can take a few weeks, maybe a couple of months. We have a lot of cases and few staff." Elena sat there, staring at the forms, the boxes, the dotted lines. The horror of Citlali and Santiago was being translated into code, into a file number. She felt nauseous. The system wasn't designed to seek justice. It was designed to process horror, to classify it, to file it away, until it got lost in a sea of folders, or until the children turned 18, whichever came first. Subtle sound of a phone call not being answered, going to voicemail. There was one last attempt. Desperate. She got the number of a local congressman. A man who had campaigned in the mountains, promising to be the voice of the voiceless. She called him 20 times. The secretary always said he was in a meeting. Finally, the congressman called her back. His voice was cheerful, smooth, the voice of a professional politician. Elena explained everything to him for the third time. Her own voice sounded worn out, weak. The congressman's response was a masterpiece of evasion. How awful. How terrible. Miss, I greatly appreciate your civic commitment. It is people like you that this country needs. There was a pause. Elena waited. Look, the congressman continued. This is a very sensitive issue. The mountains have their own codes. Intervening in the wrong way, without political tact, could cause a major social problem, a community conflict. And honestly, with the elections just around the corner, we can't afford to create instability. He fell silent, as if he had said too much. But don't worry, he added quickly. I'm going to turn the case over to my team of advisors for immediate follow-up. We'll be keeping a close eye on it. Thank you for calling Click. He hung up. Turn the case over. The phrase was an epitaph, the same one they used to file away a request to pave a street, the final nail in the coffin. Police, institutions, politicians. They had all given him the same answer. A no, disguised as procedure. A no disguised as protocol. A no disguised as political prudence. The system had not failed. The system had worked perfectly. Its function was not to protect children. It was to protect itself. To protect the status quo. To avoid problems. And the fate of Citlali and Santiago was an acceptable price to pay for that peace, for that silence. And what happened to the children? What happened to the blood pact in the mountains of Puebla? The official story will say that the system eventually worked. Months later, after Elena, in an act of final desperation, violating all professional ethics, leaked the story to a journalist from an independent media outlet. The scandal, though small and localized, was enough. Media pressure and fear of a bad image forced the authorities to act. One day, a convoy of white vans from the DIF and the state police drove up the mountain. With cameras. They took the children out of the house. Remedios did not resist. She watched them leave with the same cold, defiant gaze. They say her only question was, "Are you not going to bring them back?" She was admitted to a psychiatric institution. She was diagnosed with a mystical genealogical delusional disorder. Citlali and Santiago were separated, sent to different shelters. For their own good. The system rescued them, but the rescue came too late. The poison was already in their blood, not the poison of purity that Remedios imagined, but the poison of trauma, of broken identity. Today, Santiago is a young man of 20. He lives in a transitional home. They say he is an exemplary worker in the carpentry workshop. He is methodical, precise, but he hardly speaks. Never. Sometimes the caregivers find him at night, standing by the window, looking in the direction of the mountains, in silence, waiting for something that will never come. Citlali had a more difficult fate. Noisier. She went through 3 foster families. She ran away from all of them. She was found several times at bus stations, always trying to buy a ticket back to her village. Psychologists say she suffers from severe traumatic bonding, that her only identity is tied to her brother and the horror they experienced. For her, the house in the mountains was not a prison. It was the only world she knew, the only place where she felt like herself. The last time anyone heard from her, she was in a high-security specialized center. They were teaching her to read again, to write her name, a name she did not choose, a name tainted by the legacy of a dark pact. The system congratulates itself. It's a success story in its annual reports. 2 children saved from an abusive environment. But I ask you, the listeners, where is the success? In 2 broken souls? In 2 lives forever marked by the collective failure of a society that prefers bureaucracy to compassion? The house on the mountain is empty now. The doors and windows have been boarded up by the government. But on windy nights, the few who live nearby say you can still feel it. The cold, the silence, the weight of a secret that refused to die completely. In the end, the blood was not saved. It was only transformed into an echo of pain that will travel, invisible, for generations. I am Father of the Valley, and we'll see you in the next Realidad Mexico.